The night was clear and still over the Buckinghamshire countryside when the Glasgow to London mail train rounded a long curve near the village of Ledburn. It was just after 3 in the morning on August 8, 1963. The locomotive carried no passengers. It carried something far more valuable: 120 registered mail bags stuffed with used banknotes being returned south to the Bank of England from clearing houses across Scotland. At a road bridge spanning the railway cutting, 15 men were waiting in the dark. They had rehearsed for months. They had memorized every stage of the train schedule. What they could not have rehearsed was what would happen to the driver when the plan met reality. 50 years later, most of the money had never been recovered. The gang's chief architect had written his own memoir, and the robbery had become, to a troubling degree, a legend. This is the record of how it was actually done. Since the 1830s, the British General Post Office had operated what were known as traveling post offices on the National Rail Network. On overnight runs, teams of postal sorters worked inside dedicated carriages, processing letters and parcels in transit. By the early 1960s, the busiest of these services also carried registered post that included sealed packages of banknotes. Banks across Scotland regularly consigned large sums of used currency southward for counting and destruction at the Bank of England. These shipments were treated as ordinary registered mail, not as high-security bullion. They were overseen by a small contingent of post office workers and not by armed police. The security assumptions built into the system had not changed significantly in decades. Someone with access to the inner workings of this postal chain knew exactly which trains were carrying the largest consignments. That knowledge was the foundation on which everything else was built. The specific intelligence that made the robbery possible came from a source whose full identity has never been officially established. He was known within the gang only as the Ulsterman, a contact with access to postal sorting information who supplied advance warning of when an exceptionally large consignment would be on the train. In the summer of 1963, a bank holiday weekend was approaching, and clearinghouses across Scotland had accumulated several days' worth of surplus currency awaiting shipment. The total being carried on the night of August 7th into August 8th was later calculated at roughly £2.5 million. At 1963 values, that sum represented more than 50 times the average annual wage. The Ulsterman passed the date and the details to an intermediary. He was never charged. He was never publicly named with certainty. He remained, in every sense, the invisible element at the center of the case. Bruce Reynolds was a career thief with an unusual quality, he thought, in systems. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, he had moved from petty theft to organizing larger operations, building along the way a reputation for discipline and for choosing the right men for specific tasks. When the Ulsterman's information reached him, Reynolds began assembling what would become a crew of roughly 15. He brought in Gordon Goody, a London criminal with a record of serious offenses and a reputation for composure under pressure. He recruited Charlie Wilson and Roy James, a man who had raced professionally in junior motorsport and who had managed the getaway logistics. Buster Edwards handled contacts and communications. Each man was assigned a role defined in advance. Reynolds' organizing principle, as he later described it, was that the plan had to be precise enough that no one would need to improvise on the night. The gang secured a rural property called Leatherslade Farm in Buckinghamshire, roughly 27 miles from the target site at Bordigo Bridge, and used it as a preparation base in the weeks before the robbery. They rehearsed the physical mechanics of unloading mail bags, timing how long it would take to move 120 sacks down an embankment and into waiting vehicles. They also studied railway signaling equipment so they could halt the locomotive at the precise point they required. The plan called for the train to stop at Bordigo Railway Bridge, where a steep embankment gave direct access to the tracks. Stopping the train meant interfering with the signal gantry. A crew member covered the green light with a glove and attached a battery to the red signal, creating a false stop indication for the driver. Ronnie Biggs, a peripheral member of the group, had recruited a retired train driver to operate the locomotive once the gang boarded the cab. That arrangement would prove to be one of several things that did not hold. At approximately 3:03 in the morning of August 8, 1963, the Glasgow to London mail train came to a stop at the false red signal near Bordigo Bridge. The gang moved from their vehicles down the embankment and into the locomotive cab. Driver Jack Mills was struck on the head with a cosh. His fireman, David Whitby, was restrained. The retired driver recruited by Biggs proved unable to operate the modern locomotive controls, and so Jack Mills, injured as he was ordered to move the train forward the short distance to the bridge itself. Mills complied. The post office workers in the sorting carriages were held in place and did not intervene. The unloading then began. The men formed a human chain down the embankment and passed the mailbags hand to hand into a waiting Army surplus lorry and 2 Land Rovers. The entire operation from the train's first stop to the gang's departure lasted, by most accounts, between 15 and 20 minutes. The convoy drove through quiet Buckinghamshire roads to Leatherslade Farm, arriving before first light. The plan had always specified that the property be cleaned and vacated within 3 days, before any police search could expand to that radius. The gang counted the money. The figure later established by investigators was roughly £2.5 million in used notes of various denominations. Some was distributed almost immediately. The remainder was held for later division. What the gang did not do in those first days was leave the farm on schedule. They stayed longer than the plan required. By August 12th, the farm had not been cleared. A local farm worker reported suspicious activity at the property to police on August 13th. When detectives arrived at Leatherslade Farm, they found discarded mailbags, a Monopoly board that had been used to pass the time, paint used to disguise the vehicles, and a significant quantity of fingerprints. Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler of Scotland Yard's flying squad led the investigation. Butler was known inside the force as the Grey Fox, a name earned through decades of methodical detective work and a reputation for pursuing cases long after other officers had moved on. He had an exceptional memory for criminal associations and for the networks that connected professional thieves across London. The discovery of Leatherslade Farm gave the investigation enormous momentum. Forensic examination produced fingerprints belonging to several members of the gang. Butler and his team worked outward from those prints through criminal records and informant networks. Arrests began within weeks. Charlie Wilson was detained in August 1963. Gordon Goody was brought in that October. Bruce Reynolds, identified by Butler as the central architect of the operation, remained free for considerably longer, moving between addresses in England and eventually spending time outside the country altogether. The trial of the principal defendants opened at Aylesbury Assizes in January 1964 and concluded that April. It was among the longest and most expensive criminal trials in English legal history to that point. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Edmund Davies. When sentencing was delivered, the terms were severe. Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson, Roy James, and Ronnie Biggs each received 25 years. Other members of the gang received terms of between 20 and 25 years. Brian Field, connected to the operation through his employment at a firm of solicitors that had facilitated arrangements used by the gang, received a considerably lighter sentence reflecting his specific involvement as determined by the jury. Justice Edmund Davies stated that organized criminality on this scale demanded a proportionate deterrent. The combined custodial terms handed down in that Aylesbury courtroom were reported in contemporaneous press as amounting to more than 300 years of imprisonment. Within 16 months of sentencing, 2 men had escaped from custody. Charlie Wilson broke out of Winson Green Prison in Birmingham in August 1964, assisted by a small group who entered the grounds and overpowered prison officers. He fled to Canada and lived under an assumed name until Scotland Yard detectives located him in January 1968, after which he was returned to England to complete his sentence. Ronnie Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison in London on July 8, 1965, assisted by accomplices using a rope ladder thrown over the outer wall. He made his way to France, then to Australia, and eventually to Brazil, where the birth of a son to a Brazilian citizen gave him legal protection against extradition under the treaty arrangements then in force. He remained in Rio de Janeiro for more than 30 years. Bruce Reynolds, who had evaded Butler across 5 years in several countries, was finally arrested in Torquay in November 1968 and sentenced to 25 years. Ronnie Biggs returned voluntarily to the United Kingdom in May 2001, seriously ill and in need of medical care. He was imprisoned on his return, then released on compassionate grounds in 2009, and died on December 18, 2013 at the age of 84. Of the roughly £2.5 million taken at Brudego Bridge, approximately £400,000 was recovered by police over the following years. The rest, more than £2 million, was never officially accounted for. Jack Mills, the driver who was struck in the cab that morning, never fully recovered his health and died in 1970. The robbery acquired, in the decades that followed, a peculiar romanticism that its actual record does not support. One man was permanently harmed. Most of the money was never found. And the plan that 15 men had spent months refining, preserved now in court transcripts and police archives, ended by consuming most of those who had devised it. The train, meanwhile, had continued on its route. By the time the alarm was raised, it was already in London.